All right, let's get started. This is the Challenges and Controversies session. I'm Nikolaus Kriegeskorte. I'm very excited to discuss a very fundamental question. What would it mean to understand how the brain works? Let's face it, it's a tall order to understand how the brain works. When I was a student in the 1990s, the brain was the most exciting thing to study, and I wanted to go into it, but at the same time, it was always clear to me that it's too hard a thing, that ultimately we might never succeed at it. So are we delusional? Are we perhaps even fraudulent to promise to people that we can deliver on this? I always had quite a lot of confidence, actually, that there is, at some level, that it's impossible what we're trying to do, right? And the only consolation is sort of this kind of philosophical statement. I love those that desire the impossible. This is Konrad Curting by Goethe. And that sort of kept me going, despite the confidence that it is impossible. I was quite confident. But in the last 5 years or so, I've sort of lost this confidence that it's definitely impossible. Now I'm not sure anymore. And this makes me very confused because on the one hand, I feel we're making rapid progress and we're actually moving onto problems that seem totally out of reach. But at the same time, when I think about the form that a solution might take, I suspect that it might look very different from what we expect. And it might actually, to some of us, not be satisfying in some ways, right? So I think despite the fact that it's such a big question and a somewhat vague question, it's a question that's important for us to think about. What form would a solution to how the brain works take? When are we done? So let's imagine it's 2050 and some of us are still around, and there's a book, edition of 2050, How the Brain Works. What's the content of that book? What do we expect? I mean, it's really an interesting question, I think. Will it say neuroscientists found out how the brain works? Will it say computer scientists found out, or cognitive scientists, or cognitive computational neuroscientists? So what form will an understanding take? I mean, this relates to the philosophical question what understanding means and what an explanation is, of course. Will the book talk about ion channels and about neurons? Or will it talk about behavior, cognition, and symbols? Will it be a lot of math in it? And if so, what kind of math? Or will it just be a set of engineering techniques that enable us to build intelligence? So it could describe a big neural network model. That's what some people might say. But will that be the solution? And if so, will the network model have 10 to the 11 parameters? Or will it be much simpler? Or will it be a whole literature of sort of little models that apply to different tasks and is kind of the botany of different tasks and little models? So these are the big questions that we're going to talk about today. And we have three speakers. We have the cognitive Hyo Gweon, the computational Dan Yamins, and the neuroscience Jack Gallant. And we'll have each of them give short pitch talks, and then we'll have a discussion. So just briefly on the three of these, Hyo is an assistant professor at Stanford University in the Department of Psychology. She got her PhD from MIT, where she also did her postdoc working with Rebecca Sachs and Laura Schultz after getting a BA in psychology in Korea. Dan Yamins is also an assistant professor at Stanford. He did a postdoc at MIT working with Jim DiCarlo, who's here, I just saw, after getting a PhD in applied mathematics from Harvard. And Jack Gallant is the Chancellor's Professor at Berkeley University in the Departments of Psychology, Electrical Engineering, and Computer Science. He did a postdoc at Caltech and Washington University Medical School after getting his PhD from Yale. So Hyo studies human learning in social contexts using behavioral, computational, neural, and clinical methods, and aiming to understand the mechanisms that underlie representations and inferential processes that drive learning. Dan Yamins models vision and cognitive processes with deep neural network models, and his goal is to use AI engineering to understand the brain and also to improve AI engineering by taking inspiration from the brain. And Jack Gallant is a pioneer of using natural stimuli in vision science. In his early work, he did single-cell recordings, and he pioneered techniques of using nonlinear systems identification for making models that could predict responses to arbitrary novel natural stimuli in single cells. And over the last decade or so, he's taken this approach to human fMRI, where he's been using encoding and decoding models to map out representations over the human brain. So this session will be 90 minutes in total. There'll be the 3 pitch talks, 12 minutes each, and then a 45-minute panel discussion. We'll have some audience participation, so I want to prime you to that so you think about what to throw into the discussion. Please keep it brief, but do participate. We do want to get ideas from you, and we want to get these speakers to respond to your thoughts. So we'll have a question or two after each pitch talk, and then in the middle of the discussion, we'll have 5 minutes where we'll take a sequence of responses from you, and then go back to the panel discussion. Enjoy.
Okay. Thanks for coming to the session. Thanks, Nico, for the nice introduction for all 3 of us. We were all told that we were supposed to talk about controversial things and challenge each other. What I'm going to do, though, is to try to start from saying something that's very uncontroversial, and hopefully you agree too, which is that what we know about the world is a lot more than what we can directly experience. What's in your brain, the knowledge that we have, is a lot more than the sum of your sensory experiences that you have accumulated in your life so far. And this may sound like an obvious thing to you, but if you just sit back and think about it for a minute, it's not that obvious how we might be able to go beyond the kinds of things that we can directly experience with the world. And it's a question that intrigues me, hopefully many of you too, and it has many possible answers as well. But what I'm going to argue is that this is one of the quintessential things that cognition allows us to do. And especially if we think of cognition as something that provides an interface between sensing and acting, we think of cognition as something that's in the middle. What's really neat about human cognition is that it's really, really good at allowing us to go beyond the evidence that we observe. Let me just play a video clip of a 3-year-old playing. It's just a 50-second clip.
See this? Stop. What is it? This is a blicket. Stop. What's a blicket?
So she sees an object that's called a blicket, demonstrated by an adult.
To play with while I write something down, okay?
And she tries for a while, but none of the blocks that she got stick.
Thank you. No, it's still not sticking. How do these stick?
Just let me know when you're done playing.
Oh, they're not sticking.
That's weird.
I think there's no stickiness anymore. Come on. These are not working. Maybe I can build something.
Just let me know when you're done playing, okay?
Well, you can. Ethan wants to help me build a tower.
So what you have just observed is a 50-second clip of a child playing with a sibling and another adult. From less than a minute of a child's play, what you see is a range of behaviors that we call cognition, what we call learning. She observes what's happening around her. She observes other people's actions, and she recognizes things and people, their actions and utterances, and she interprets them in order for her to know that, oh, this is a thing that sticks, and other things are supposedly sticking too. So she generalizes the property to other objects that are also called blickets by this person, but it turns out that they don't stick, so she explores. But it's not just random exploration. She has a targeted hypothesis that she wants to test, and she performs those behaviors in a targeted way, systematic way. And once she gets a lot of counter evidence that doesn't fit her hypothesis, she's trying to explain it. She does novel actions. She's trying to stick them together to see if they would stick to each other. And what's also cool is that she's trying to communicate the whole time. She's asking questions. She's telling her that it doesn't work, and she's trying to get her attention. So a lot of things are happening all within the span of 50 seconds. So how is this possible? What does it mean for us to understand how these mental operations occur in the brain and manifest as observable behaviors? And I think that's all we're interested in trying to understand. Now, that's maybe the bigger goal, the long-term goal, and maybe by 2050, we probably won't have a full understanding of how that actually happens in the brain. Can we ever get there? It's easy to have this idea that we're not going to get there anytime soon, so what are we doing here? What I'm going to try to do is that it's really important for us to have a concrete short-term goals, even though they may be baby steps. So what I'm going to try to do in this session, doing my job, is to provide a cognitive scientist perspective, examples of maybe partial successes that we already might have, what meaningful progress might look like, and talk about some of the challenges that remain. So if you think about the brain as an information processing system, you may think of, how we are going to study it. There's a person who provided a way of thinking about how to think about how it works. Marr famously said, almost never can a complex system of any kind be understood as a simple extrapolation from the properties of its elementary components. And what he did right after saying that in his book is to try to provide an example of a gas in a bottle. So here's a system, here's a thing that you can try to perturb, and you can try to think about the molecules moving around in this bottle. If you heat it up, or if you decrease the volume, or if you put more gas in it, we can try to observe what might happen as an effect. We can measure them in terms of temperature, pressure, density, and so on and so forth. What we need is a macroscopic level description of how these effects might be related to one another, the classical the theory of thermodynamics. And what's cool is that they can be reduced down to a relatively simple principle that we can describe in words, but also written down in math. What's cool is that what it can do is to be explained by more microscopic level descriptions, statistical thermodynamics that tries to approximate the movements of particles in a way that actually interfaces with the macroscopic level. But this was possible because there was a reduction from the top down. We had a principle of how it might work so that we can try to even start thinking about how each one of the individual particles might move around. Now, so we are all familiar with the Marr's 3 levels: computational theory at the top level, representational algorithmic level, hardware implementation level. What I'm guessing is that all 3 of us are supposed to somewhat represent parts of this picture. And although Marr was okay with the idea that different levels of explanations are pursued in a somewhat independent way, I think what we're trying to do sitting in this conference is to try to think about how they might be actually interfacing with each other. An example of a partial success is that reinforcement learning and dopamine, and I think many of you in this room might agree with that, at least it's a partial success. There's a goal at the computational level that's well described in terms of agent and actions and states and rewards and prediction error. We have algorithms that allow the agent to achieve this goal, and there's a neural system that seems to be implementing reward prediction error that allows us to make predictions at the higher level as well. Of course, the picture may be more complex and many questions and limitations remain, but it does provide a meaningful link between the microscopic and macroscopic levels. What I'm going to say is that this is all very nice. However, there are many kinds of things that cannot be explained easily by reinforcement learning. There's a lot more to human cognition. Beyond learning from past experiences and using it to predict the future, beyond retrieving memory to identify or recognize the external world, we're building rich causal models of the world, and that includes me and the world states as an agent who's navigating the world, but also it includes objects in space and their properties, as well as you, other people, as well as their mental states. So you guys are also an agent like me who's behaving in the world, and the fact that we're all in the same world behaving in different ways actually makes the learning a lot easier. So what I'm going to show you is an example of a study that maybe tries to say something about what kinds of models of the world that a child might be building. So imagine a case where a person tries to show you 3 blue toys. It's a study with infants. They involve toys. And what the person does is to squeeze each one of these toys to show that it squeaks. It may not be fun, but it's very fun for infants. The cool thing is that what you may be learning from these 3 examples is that, oh, these blue toys squeak, just like when the person said the blickets stick. However, what we showed in this study is that they learn different kinds of things depending on where they came from. So when the 3 toys are sampled from this kind of box, the 3 samples, the 3 exemplars, are plausibly sampled in a way that's consistent with either the idea that she was randomly sampling from the entire box, or maybe just from the blue box. The baby might not be sure. So they came from the same box, so when the baby gets a yellow toy, she doesn't have a reason to think that it doesn't squeak. So if you're a curious child who's acting on the world, you might as well just squeeze a toy. And especially what happened is that we took out the squeaking mechanism so that if the child is really sure that it's going to squeak, the child is going to perseverate on the toy. Things are a little bit different when the 3 toys come from a different box with a reverse ratio that is mostly yellow. And in this case, it's a very, very unlikely sample if the person was sampling from the whole box. And it's likely that the person was trying to sample just from the set of blue toys, presumably because they squeak. Now, here's a reason to think that the yellow toy might not be a squeaky toy. So if it doesn't squeak, I'm going to do something else with it. Let me just show you a video clip of children who are in 2 different conditions. I'm going to play them at the same time.
You want to go ahead and play?
This is for you.
That's for you.
So what you see is that the baby on the left, she briefly explores the other end, but she goes back to squeezing the toy. Although the boy on the other hand, he doesn't really, he's not interested in squeezing the toy. He's doing other things with it. So the idea, so if I just show you the data, what children do is to squeeze the toy more in one condition than the other, and this reflects the underlying probability of the sample being taken out from the population. And it's not just these 2 conditions, but in a series of conditions, what we have shown is that children do respond in a graded way. It reflects the relative strength of their beliefs about the idea that the data were likely sampled from the hypothesis that's consistent with the idea that all toys are squeaky. Now, the model, you can express the child's belief in a very, very simple model that is the likelihood between 2 competing hypotheses, one being that the toys were sampled from the entire box, all toys squeak, or the idea that only the blue toys are squeaky. However, what's also neat is that the model has a sampling the term that provides an idea of how the person is sampling from the box. That is, whether the person was trying to sample just from the deliberately sampling from the toys that are squeaky, or was the person randomly sampling from the entire box. What's cool about this is that the model not only provides a very nice fit between the behavioral data and the model predictions, but the model, you might say that, oh, this was built for the specific task, and it's specialized for predicting exactly what might happen in this case, but it might not generalize. What I want to say is that not about this specific task, but asking where does this intuition come from? When the sample seems to be low probability, why do we think that this person must have sampled from a specific set? And what I'm going to tell you is that the intuition that we had along the way is that the rarer the blue toys are, the harder they are to draw. That is, it's more costly for an agent who's acting on the world in order to select specifically those blue toys, especially when the container contains a lot more yellow toys than the number of blue toys. What we're doing, what's nice is that this provides a computation level theory or description of how agents are thinking about other agents, that there's a principle of efficiency that we're attributing to other agents. We call this the naive utility calculus. We see other agents as rational planners, utility maximizers. It's not just that we as an agent are trying to maximize our utilities, we see other agents as utility maximizers. And this allows us to think about their planning based on their beliefs and desires. And the ways in which these principles are described are nicely very consistent with what the behavioral studies have found for the past decade as well as more recently. So the idea here is that what we have is a causal model of how agents are behaving in the world. The baby who saw the person sampling from the box had a model of how this person might be planning her actions in terms of her goals and how she was planning her actions in order to minimize the cost of her actions. This allows us to do many different kinds of inferences over different kinds of mental states as other agents are navigating across physical states of the world. And I'm not going to go into details of any of them, but what this allows us to do is to build simple principles and express them in simple math about how people can observe actions and then infer rewards from their actions, whether the person likes this red thing as opposed to the green thing, or how we can jointly infer both rewards and costs from their actions. If you observe this person transversing this terrain, you can see that the pink terrain is probably a high cost because he's trying to navigate around it, and the two boxes, he doesn't care about neither of them. There's a chance that he might like the thing in the middle, but because of the cost, he's not getting it. And we can also jointly infer beliefs and desires. And the thing is that we can express them in terms of relatively simple math, and we know precisely what these numbers mean. I'm not gonna go to that. So the main point that I'm trying to make is that there are some psychological concepts that have stood the test of time, and these are beliefs as in subjective probabilities, desires, rewards, and cost, and we have been using them for decades, and I hope we are still using them in 2052. If we have a good computational level description of human cognition using these terms, then we can express how complex behaviors might emerge in these terms. We can formalize them in relatively simple math. They can capture different aspects of behavior depending on the context and task. However, the important thing is that these are families of models that are based on the same underlying principle and framework. And each and every case, we know exactly what those numbers mean. And because we know what they mean, we also have some ideas about where to look for the key quantities and key states that they are using in the models. And this allows us to move beyond feature-based approaches, or at least beyond features that are selected by our intuitions, and allows us to take a more principled approach into finding out what is in the brain and how they're implemented in the brain. Of course, challenges remain. How are those quantities represented? Is the strength of the signal, spatial pattern across voxels, representational similarity? How are these representations transformed as they go from sensory input to the final behavior? How are we to understand the connectivity between the brain regions and network? Are they networks of multivariate representations? However, all these methodological improvements are important, and understanding how these quantities are represented are important too. However, in order for us to understand those better, beyond presenting stimuli and analyzing the measurements, what we need to do is to find the right kind of behavior and the right kind of task. So in order to elicit a particular cognitive process that allows us to tease apart different hypotheses in ways that are amenable to the ways in which we collect the data from the brain. So that's one of the challenges that I'm presenting to all of you. And how are we to start even thinking about different agents navigating the world, thinking of other agents, reasoning about them in terms of their planning in terms of their plans. So we're planning over other planners, and we plan over other plans, other people's plans about themselves as well. So this ability creates all kinds of rich dynamics as we navigate the social world. We have some ideas about how to describe them in computational terms at the cognitive level, but how they're implemented in the brain, this is an open question, wide open for all of you. So that's where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn over to Dan.
Do we have a different? So this is about David Marr's levels framework. And so there's been this recent view articulated by people like Stefan Malat.
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating the question?
All right, so this is about David Marr's levels framework. So there's been this recent view articulated by people like Stefan Malat that the Marr view is fundamentally misguided. So for example, Malat says that computer vision has been guided by this whole notion, and for 30 years they've been looking at figuring out algorithms using a fair bit of very sophisticated mathematics without, with successes, but not the kinds of successes that we are seeing now with deep learning. So Malat feels that the underlying substrate, which Marr just calls the implementation level, is very important, and that there may not be a clean separation between algorithms and the implementation level. So would you like to comment?
So the question for me is?
So in view of this opposing view of Marr being misguided, whereas you seem to not think so from your slide. So I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Right, so I think the analogy between computer vision and human cognition may be misguided in the first place, where I think Marr might have been a great vision scientist. He might have not been a very good cognitive scientist. So what I'm taking from him is not his approach to vision itself. However, what I'm taking is his guiding principle for us as scientists to try to take on what to prioritize. And of course, what I didn't mean to say is that the computational level theory is the most important, and everyone should start there. Each one of these levels is important for us too, but at least what I wanted to say is that having a good principle at the top level allows us to formulate better hypotheses at the neural level. At the same time, we should also care about how the bottom approach can constrain our theories too. So that's, I'm not sure if I answered the question straightforwardly, but that's where I am.
Thanks. Hi, okay, great, thanks for having me. It was really good to be able to go after Hyo, because I think that really set up well what I would want to say, which is, so the question that was posed to us was, what does it mean to understand how the brain works? And so the first thing we want to think about is, like, why do we care how the brain works? And we only care about it fundamentally because it does a bunch of interesting behaviors. And, you know, actually, I don't need to say much about them because Hyo has told us, I mean, showed us great videos of exactly the kind of behaviors that are so interesting. But of course, there's like sensory and motor things, there's decision making, memory, learning. I don't need to belabor the point that cognition has a lot of interesting behaviors associated with it. And I think that it's exactly right that, you know, being an agent and being with other agents is what unifies all of these things. So I'm definitely starting in the same place that Hyo was. And so my answer to the question, you know, given that we're motivated because of these behaviors, is that we want to, when it comes to understanding the brain, here's one answer, it may not be the only one, but mine is easily build an artificial system that, one, behaves like the human at high resolution. I'll come back and say what I think each term means. And two, whose internal parts can be mapped to the parts of the brain at some chosen level of resolution. So one, you want it to be to do the behaviors, this model, this artificial system. And two, you want its internal parts to map to those of the brain in some way. Okay, so there's a lot of terms in there that mean something particular to me, and I'll try to talk briefly about what they each mean. So first is, easily build actually is a really loaded term, and I'm going to talk more about it later, but in a simple case, what it really basically means is simulate at low cost, something that you can actually, you know, of course you can build a cognitive system, it takes 9 months, right? Not that, we want something that's fast, right? Okay, right. What I mean by artificial system is probably a neural network, though in general, I don't think I'm stuck on that. There's many other model classes that might be interesting. But if you're interested in the brain, neural networks are a reasonable place to start. Behaves like a human, that's a little bit more complicated term for me. But what that means is, A, it should at least have the same types of input sensors that the human agent has, like eyes and ears and stuff, right? It should have similar types of output actuators, like things like that you can do actions in the world, right? It doesn't have to be exactly the same probably to be interesting, but it should have output actuators. Given that it's got similar input sensors and similar output actuators, the system should generate a similar input-output map that the humans do, and it should develop and learn in similar ways. Okay, so let's drill down into each of these, okay? Well, really the ones that are interesting here are, what does it mean to generate a similar input-output map? For my purposes, I really want to interpret that generously, right? So it's not just only dumb input-output maps like the ones I typically study, which are like, given an image, will you do the right choice A, B on the screen? That is a form of input-output map, behavioral input-output map. But it should also be as smart as can pass the Turing test in language or have the kinds of behavioral properties, output properties that Hyo showed. So by having a similar input-output map, I mean that given the types of stimuli that we can reliably show to a human, that it behaves a similar way, okay? And what I mean by develops and learns a similar way is two things. One is that, by learning, I mean that it changes itself in response to environmental input the way the human would. And by develop, it means you actually have some idea of how you can start it out like a baby and have it change independently of the environmental input. Okay? So those four things, having the right input and output sensors, having the right input-output map, and developing and learning the similar way, those are really a tall order from a behavioral point of view. This is like the contents of what it means to behave like a human. It's a really hard thing. Okay? And in particular, it should be demanded at a pretty high resolution, right? Really anything that can be measured with a psychology experiment, okay, seems to matter, right? For example, not just that you should be able to achieve high performance on a task from a model, but it actually should have detailed error patterns that match what the agent does, okay? Agents are typically wrong in some cases, humans are wrong in some cases, right in others according to whatever metric you care about. You should have the same error patterns of behavior at whatever resolution you can reliably measure with a psychology experiment. So that's what I mean by behaves like a human. Now let's move over to the neural side. Internal parts should map to the internal parts of the brain at some level of resolution. Okay, so this is a picture illustrating a case that I'm familiar with. Some others in the audience may be familiar. This is basically the idea that the ventral visual pathway of humans and non-human primates, which basically processes incoming images and takes retinal images and allows you to eventually, after a number of processing stages, support complex behavior under a variety of variability of the image. That sort of hierarchical system can be mapped to at some level of resolution by the early, intermediate, and late layers of a convolutional neural network. It's not a perfect match, but there's some level of matching that can go on there. And we could talk about the details of how that might be done, but what suffice it to say is that early layers of these deep nets resemble in their feature outputs early areas of the ventral visual pathway. Intermediate layers resemble intermediate areas in the visual system, and higher layers of these conv nets look a bit like the outputs of the higher areas of the visual pathway. Now, when I say mapped to, what I mean something is like the ability to find an invertible correspondence so that the intermediate input-output of the corresponding parts is the same, right? This is where instead of it being, it's not just about mapping an input to an output overall, it's really that you want the inputs and outputs locally to match. There's many problems technically with defining that, and I don't think any of us has a perfect idea of exactly how to measure or check that, but I think we're sort of going towards the direction of being able to do that. You might think that it's actually easy to define what you mean by parts of the brain, the parts that you want to map to, but actually that's pretty challenging. Because imagine you have two brains, monkey 1 and monkey 2, or human 1 and human 2. In some cases, there might be a perfect match at a neuron level, 1-to-1 between the two brains. Maybe in the retina, that could be true. But certainly that's not true in higher brain areas, right? So what does it even mean to say that you have similarity between two brain areas in two individuals? That's a challenging problem, and that means that it's not totally obvious what parts of the brain should mean, okay? In some cases, for example, like in higher visual cortex, we've chosen often to use something like linear regression, meaning that one person's brain area, one person's higher visual cortex should look like a rotation or a dilation of the other. That may not be totally true experimentally. It's an open question, but I think there's a lot of reason to suspect that some kind of operation that's fairly simple should relate to people's brains in a given area, because otherwise, what would it mean to even study that brain area? Okay, so by parts of the brain, what I mean as the parts of the brain as limited by similarity between conspecifics. Okay. And finally, in the last part of that sentence is that you have to choose a level of resolution, okay? So the chosen level of resolution really depends on your goals, and I think that this is something that different people can take differently. I don't think there's necessarily one perfect level of resolution to do this at. Me personally, for the moment, I'm like, I want to be explaining sort of firing rates at sort of 10 millisecond bins. That seems like a pretty good place to start. I think it's a choice. It can be chosen to be a lot finer grained than that, or it can be chosen to be a lot coarser than that, and I think there's good reasons for doing different things in different cases. There may be certain special levels of resolution. I don't know even how to define that exactly, but I think that's also a really interesting open question. So returning to this answer, which I've now sort of unpacked, to understanding for me means being able to easily build an artificial system that behaves like a human and has that mapping at some chosen level of resolution, you know, brain model to brain part mapping. But I packed a lot into easily build that I think is really worth exploring a bit. So real brains are constructed by evolution and development. I'm going to call that evo-devo, okay? An evolutionary developmental process, right? So whatever our process for easily building should be, it should be a bit evo-devo-like, all right? So let me try to formulate that in 3 components. First of all, whenever you're making a model, for example, in the case of the visual system, you're not starting with one architecture. You're starting with a class of possible architectures, kind of corresponding to the set of things that evolution could have chosen from, okay? In this case, maybe you might pick the class of convnets. In some other areas that you might be interested in the brain, you might pick some other class. Of course, because there's an evolutionary goal, you should be picking an ethologically valid task. Possibly like object categorization. You might be studying a brain area where it's nothing like object categorization. You never even are sure, even in the case of the ventral visual pathway where people think object categorization is a reasonable proxy, there's probably lots of other things that are equally good or better tasks that would be better proxies for what evolution actually cared about, okay? But you should pick at least one challenging ethologically valid task. And the third component that you really need to have is some kind of learning rule. Okay? Some process by which the system absorbs data about how good it is at the task and changes its parameters accordingly. Okay? So basically the idea here, and this is the sort of evo-devo-like building process, is that if you start out at a random location or some location that's under-constrained, you, in this big model space of possibilities, you apply the learning rule to solving a task, and that drives you down onto a much smaller space of possibilities in architecture space. And then you can ask, okay, does that look like the brain? Okay, so this is not a process by which you sort of like posit in your mind, I think that's exactly how to solve it. I'm going to sit down and write it down, and it's going to be a beautiful, perfectly crystalline model. This is really a learning. It's a learning procedure. And that learning procedure somehow matches in some way the way the actual system was constructed evolutionarily and developmentally. So just to sort of belabor the point, there's 3 pieces here. There's an architecture class, some kind of goal or task, and finally a learning rule. And we can talk about the details. I think that this is not exactly the Marr formulation. It's related to it in some ways, but it also is orthogonal to the Marr formulation in some ways. I think an important type of result that's been clear in the cases of at least some higher sensory systems in humans and non-human primates is that that strategy seems to work reasonably well. Okay? In other words, if you choose a very challenging, ecologically relevant task, like word recognition in the case of thinking about auditory cortex, or object recognition in the case of thinking about visual cortex, that there's a strong relationship between solving those tasks and being able to predict neural responses in the cortical systems that, of interest. Okay? And so that's a kind of heuristic for how to think about building models in general, potentially. Of course, there's no such thing as a perfect learning rule. And in general, even like real evolution, right, is subject to incomplete optimization, capture by local minima. So model failures are predicted, and they should match those of the real organism. It's important to recognize that what's happening here is not the same as a curve fit to data. Okay? Constraints are coming from a goal, not from the neural data directly. And understanding is really the idea that, what I would mean by understanding is that intermediates that look like neural data should emerge from your understanding of what the constraints are, your ability to formulate the constraints. Multiple optima may be okay. And of course, in those cases may mean something like having several distinct hypothesis classes, or maybe even the ability to model real population variability. The kind of understanding I'm talking about is definitely not sort of crystalline understanding the way that you might imagine an early visual cortex with things like Gabor wavelets describing closed form solutions to the tuning curves. But it's more thought about in this way. A very famous theoretical biologist, Dobzhansky, once said that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Okay? And that's been specialized in the case of neuroscience, I think, very nicely by Gordon Shepard. Nothing in neuroscience makes sense except in light of behavior. Okay, so I'll just close by saying what I think that where I'm coming from is that nothing in computational cognitive neuroscience makes sense except in light of optimization. Okay, thanks. And
A question or two while Jack is setting up. Go to the mic.
okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you brought up task. Your formulation of understanding focuses on task. At one point you mentioned the Turing task, and then another point you talked about things that psychologists
Can measure.
Those are fairly different. At least psychology right now is typically probing much simpler things than the Turing test is aimed at. So I'm wondering if you think that increasing the complexity of the task is an important part of the project, or if we're okay where we are now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, is it important to increase the complexity of tasks? So first thing I would say is, some people in psychology are studying really complicated, like sophisticated tasks. Look at what Hyo is looking at there. To me, that's a really sophisticated kind of task. But I think in general, maybe I would say the neuroscientists are typically not looking at complex enough tasks. Maybe psychologists are, but neuroscientists generally are not. And I think that a good way to think about when you should have a complex task is to realize that there's a contravariance principle at work in what I just said. And what I mean by that is just a fancy term for the following simple idea. The harder the task, the greater the task difficulty, the smaller the space of possible solutions there are to it, right? So therefore, the more likely you are to have whatever solution pop out look like the one that the brain chose, right? It's really dumb, right? The harder the task, the fewer the ways there are to solve it. So what that means is if you want to do a computational cognitive approach, you shouldn't try to first solve the dumbest version of the task, thoroughly understand it, and then, only then, ramp up your difficulty. You're probably going to get more confused by that than anything, because there's all these spurious solutions. Okay, so I think you're ready.
This is the second one of these I've done in like 6 months. So I'm beginning to feel like the old man who comes out on his porch every 6 months and goes, "Crazy kids, get off my lawn." So I also want to point out that I know that Nico is from New York University and therefore always thinks that I'm from Berkeley University, but actually I'm from the University of California, Berkeley. So, and if you didn't get that joke, he always does that to me, so I decided to get even. All right. There are three perspectives on understanding that came in at different times. The first is the perspective from physical sciences that started in the Enlightenment and went up until World War II, although in psychology, oftentimes you'll hear people give voice to psychology being like physics, even though the way psychologists do science is very different. The second started in World War II with information theory and went all up. It sort of reached its zenith in the 1980s and then stayed kind of static, which is thinking about understanding the brain in terms of a computer system that has algorithms and representations. And the third is the more recent view that Dan Well presented on deep learning that just started really, it's been sort of nascent for 30 years, but really got going in the last 10 years when deep networks became successful. So let's deal with each of these in turn. To think about the physical sciences, it's simplest really to go back to how the physical sciences teach us to do experiments, which is I've got a phenomenon I'm interested in. I build a measurement device to measure my phenomenon. I measure it. I get some data. And then I make an explanation that explains the data, hopefully using a number of dimensions that is smaller than the data points I measured. And I want that explanation to be as elegant as possible. And given equal performance of the models, I'm going to pick the most elegant solution. And then to test my model, I'm going to actually predict its performance on a new data set that either involves, say, new stimuli and tasks that are within the space of the original stimuli and tasks, or completely new stimuli and tasks, ideally. And if we're right, we should be able to explain all of that data. So there's two aspects of this, I think, that are important to think about that we don't usually think about when we're deciding what experiments to do. This is a kind of a nested Venn diagram of variance and variance explained. And of course, if you're thinking about solving a data analysis problem as a regression problem, then you always think about explaining variance. So of course, if you have a behaving animal or a human, there's the total amount of variance in the animal's behavior that you need to explain at some point under all possible situations that could ever occur. And until you can do that, you don't have a final model. Of course, you're not going to observe your animal or human under all possible conditions. You're just going to observe him under a small set of conditions. So the gray box is not really accessible to us. It's going to be the green circle is the total amount of variance in the stimulus and task subspace that we want to explain, whatever task we're interested in. Now, we're going to collect a finite data set. We're not going to have an infinite amount of data. We're going to have 1,000 data points or 2,000 data points. So the number of data points actually places a noise ceiling on the potential explanation. Even if we have a perfect model, if we have finite data, we're not going to perfectly predict the data set out of set. So that further constrains the amount of variance we have to explain, which is the blue circle. Then we have an actual model that we build, and we try to explain some variance, and that model is usually not going to reach the noise ceiling, so that's the red circle. And then if we're doing conventional cognitive science, where we don't actually ever test predictions, we just test statistical significance, that's the little black circle in the middle. So what we want is to explain the gray circle, which is all of the data that could potentially be explained, and what we oftentimes explain is the black circle, which is what data can I explain that's not random. And ideally, we want to push that circle out as far as possible. Now, when we're testing our models, oftentimes in cognitive science, we don't use separate fit and test sets. And the one thing that computer scientists learned over the past 30 years is if you don't use separate fit and test sets, you will overfit your data and you will cheat yourself. So they are very strict about using separate fit and test data sets, and this hasn't really come into play in our field on a large scale yet, but people are slowly moving toward that. The first order way to separate fit and test data sets is you take all of your sampling points in your stimulus and task space, shown here on the left in red, and you use them to fit your model. And then you take a new set of points within the stimulus and task space, shown in blue, and you test on those points. And that's called a fit set and a test set. And if your model does that, then you're happy. And any decent model should do this because, of course, all that's required to do this is interpolation. And any model, any decent regression model should be able to interpolate. Otherwise, something really bad has happened. On the right is what, of course, you really want to do in the end, which is to predict on a set of points in a stimulus and task space that are actually in a different part of the space than the points that you're testing on. And if you can do that, you've really done something miraculous because you can't solve that particular problem by interpolation. You have to solve it by extension. And only the best possible models are going to be able to do that. And I don't think there's very many cases, if any, in neuroscience or cognitive science that manage to solve that problem. Okay, so the second view of understanding, which is rooted in computer science, was well described by Hyo. It's this idea that comes out of Alan Newell and David Marr that essentially you want to describe the brain in terms of a program. A program is a set of functions that operate on some data structures under the control of some control system. And so our job as cognitive scientists is to recover the functions, recover the data structures, and recover the control system. And then the more recent view, the deep network view, is that deep networks learn complicated, high-dimensional mappings directly from the data. These representations do not have to make any intuitive sense to a human. And therefore, understanding means finding a network that is essentially isomorphic to the data and to the behavior. And that may, the best you may be able to do in that is to recover the optimization principles rather than the representations. So the encoding model approach, which I tend to favor, is consistent with this. And encoding models is basically just a general linear model framework. We have some data, we have some responses, and we want to use regression to fit a model between the data and the responses. And you can view this as an inference problem, or you can view it as an optimization problem. So it's basically just regression or Bayes' theorem. And the question is what kind of model you're going to use. The problem in this framework isn't statistics. These statistics are really well worked out. We've known about them for hundreds of years. The problem is figuring out what your model is going to be. And that turns out to be a big problem. And that's one case where neural networks can actually help this classical inference perspective. The reason this encoding model approach satisfies the first and second definitions of understanding, meaning the one from physical sciences and computer sciences, is that encoding models contain explicit feature spaces that we can understand. These are essentially a feature space as a function that operates on a representation. The dimensionality of the feature space is usually fairly low relative to the measurements that you took. The encoding models generate predictions that are quantitative and are out of the set in the type 1 sense, meaning you can generate, using these models, predictions about how the system will respond to new stimuli and tasks interpolated between the stimuli and tasks used to fit the model. And all the predictions in these encoding models are relative to a noise ceiling. So we don't just look at statistical significance. We estimate what the best possible model you could ever build would be, how well that would perform based on the data you have, and we reference all of the prediction performance to that. The advantage of that is you know when you're done. Once you've explained all the potentially explainable variants, then there's no more to be done with that data. And finally, if you are really buff, you can try to incorporate control schemes into these encoding models, for example, using a Markov framework or something like that. But that tends to be trickier. That's always harder. It's also harder, of course, for neural networks, as discussed in the previous session. Okay, so most decoding models used in cognitive neuroscience don't actually they don't satisfy the definitions of understanding. And the reason for that is that linear classifiers basically don't have any notion of the noise ceiling or the prediction ceiling. They only essentially are compared based on statistical significance. So you can determine that one classifier is significantly better than another, but you can't tell if one classifier is decoding all of the potentially decodable information. That's a very difficult problem. You can solve it, but only if you have essentially infinite data. That's what Bill Bialik and Rob de Ruyter did back in the 1980s. So the question is, what about deep networks? Because everybody's all excited about deep networks. People are making billions of dollars on deep networks. Should we be using them in neuroscience, and what should we be using them for? That's, I think, really what this session's about. Even Nico, wherever he went, Nico mentioned that at the introduction. So are deep networks consistent with all three of these versions of understanding, or just one of them? Clearly, deep networks are consistent with the third version of understanding, since that's based on deep networks. But is it consistent with the first two? So some aspects of deep networks may not be consistent with these first two views of understanding, because deep networks usually, often, not always, require many more free parameters than you have measurements. So you've gone from a low-dimensional measurement space to a high-dimensional model space. Now, that won't affect your predictions. It might actually help your predictions. But that kind of solution is certainly not elegant in the traditional sense of how we think of an elegant model. Deep networks are notoriously difficult to interpret. So taking a deep network and then extracting its guts to figure out what it's doing and why it's doing it is really, really hard, essentially unsolved problem, as I thought was really well demonstrated in the earlier talk today. And it's very difficult to know whether an apparently uninterpretable network is truly uninterpretable, like I've got a deep network, I can't really figure out what it does, or I just haven't tried hard enough to interpret it. And just to give you an idea of how uninterpretable these things are, on the right, on the bottom, is a deep network fit to V4 neurons. So these are 4 V4 neuron receptive fields. And these neurons, these network models fit really, really well, but these neurons are uninterpretable in any human sense. That may be the end, or it may not be. It's hard to tell. So as far as whether we should be able to interpret these models, one thing to keep in mind is that many areas of the human cortex are selective for very specific features, and they don't seem to be random. That may not always be true. There may be regions of the human cortex that you can't interpret it. but there are clearly a lot that you can, and we should want a model, a framework that satisfies both of those. And finally, I just want to close on trying to link this back to behavior. Notice I really didn't talk about behavior at all in this talk, and the reason is, in my opinion, it is very, very difficult to link brain measurements or brain models to behavior. And the best paper that I know of out there is actually by Dave Popel, who was talking about how difficult it is to take brain data in language and map it to language models. But I think this is a very general problem. The language and the theories we have for dealing with behavior that come out of traditional cognitive psychology don't ever, almost ever, map very well onto the brain data we have, because brain networks have emergent properties that give rise to behavior that we don't really understand yet. So in closing, I just want to point out that if, when the book comes out in 2050, if the best we can do for modeling is to create these hideously complicated, deep neural networks that no human could possibly understand, I will be very sad. Thanks.
We'll take a question for Jack while we set up.
Hello. I really liked all the talks, but actually I had one question. If I was asked whether I knew how cars worked, I might say yes because I know how combustion engines works, and I'd say yes because I know how gear ratios worked. But then when my car breaks down, I actually have to go find somebody who understands how cars work to fix my car. And none of you guys address this kind of fundamental part of knowing, which is the ability to fix and understand problems that occur in these systems. And I think a lot of these representations say, I could understand the brain, but then when somebody with a problem comes to you, you would say, okay, well, I don't understand it well enough to help you. Do you think that's a limitation to the ideas that you guys are talking about?
First of all, that was awesome. That was awesome, and you should have given one of these talks. Second of all, how many neuroscientists out here can fix the brain? Yeah, that's what I thought. So, yeah. I think that's a really good point. And I think fixing the brain is harder than understanding the brain because there's an asymmetry between encoding and decoding, and there's an asymmetry between reading and writing. And if we're just trying to understand the brain, we're essentially reading it, and if we're trying to change it, we're writing it. But point taken.
Hi. I'm wondering whether building artificial neural networks will help at all in understanding how the brain works. Because in a way, they're black boxes. And you can imagine that the best neural network you can possibly build is by taking a brain and copying neuron by neuron its functional properties, plugging it back together in an artificial system, and there you have a perfect model of the brain. That'll do exactly like the brain.
Do you get money from the European Brain Project? Because that's essentially a description of the European brain. On a statistical level, but still. I personally actually think neural networks are incredibly useful for understanding the brain. Certainly in my business, to solve one specific problem, which is oftentimes if we're analyzing really complicated tasks, we don't know what the features are. And we don't even have any good way to come up with a candidate set of features. And if you build a neural network that kind of does the same task, the features are embedded implicitly in that network if it's performing the task similar to humans. The question for me is really, can you take that network and then extract its basic principles of coding? And as we've seen since deep networks came out in 2012, that turns out to be a really, really hard problem. So some people, who shall remain nameless in this audience, have kind of given up on that problem and have started focusing on a different problem, which is just how to build the networks. And I personally don't think we should give up on that problem because I think humans, including me, are lazy, and it's easier to build a neural network than to try to figure out what the neural network's doing. And I don't think if we decide that building a neural network is all we have to do, then that's all anybody will do, and we'll never get anywhere. You can argue with me, Dan.
Oh yeah, no, I think we're supposed to.
All right, please take a seat.
Yeah. No, I totally copped that. I will not remain nameless.
So let's take a moment for the three of you to respond to each other. Maybe Dan, you can start, and then Hyo.
Sure. I guess I admire both of your approaches a lot, but I guess the one remaining question that still bothers me is, Dan, you're building a human being. Do you think it'll really develop like a human child? Unless you explicitly build in a model of the world in a way that I was trying to argue for. There's still many, many parameters that we have no idea what they exactly mean. If we're building a human, then maybe yes. if we're understanding a human being, then I'm not quite so sure. At the end of the day, what are we going to understand what the parts are and how they're related to one another? And can we call that an understanding if we build something that acts like a human being and make errors like a human being? So that's my one response to you.
I think there's a couple questions in there. One is a very particular, really interesting science question, which is, do you think we're going to get agents that act like human beings unless we build certain things into the architecture? And to me, that's like a key interesting science question, and I don't want to venture an opinion on that because I think we just don't know. And so let me phrase that question in the framework that I presented, which is basically you have two architecture classes that you've basically suggested. One is the one without the structure, the one without the world model explicitly built in. And then there's another structure which may have more priors built into the structure of the architecture class, and you can just ask, optimize for some behavior of some kind, whatever you think might be driving development, and see what occurs. Is it the case that the unconstrained one actually develops behavioral patterns like the humans? Maybe not. Does the one that has that more built-in thing, does it have a final sort of adult behavioral state that looks more like human adults? Does it have a developmental trajectory that looks more like the measurable developmental trajectories that you guys can measure? Maybe it does, and that would, I think, be evidence for the hypothesis you need to have something built in. If, on the other hand, you see the other result, then no. To me, it's like, that's like a great open science question that drives me, but I think you can address it in the framework that I suggested without my being able to tell you an answer ahead of time. So I would love to know.
I guess go ahead. One question then back to you is, like, that's one way to approach the question. We're going to see what happens, and if it doesn't work, then we're going to know that there needs to be something built in the beginning. But why don't, you were talking about the role of evolution there, but we already know from a lot of different results that we have from comparative science, cognitive science, that there are seemingly some structures that are shared with other animals, like a spatial navigation system, or the ways in which we might think about how objects move in the world. Why can't some of those at least be built in?
I think probably they should be. Mm-hmm. Like I think that's let me just rephrase how I would approach it. I would have two types of model classes. In fact, this is how we are currently approaching it in the lab. Two types of model classes simultaneously. One without the built-ins and one with some built-ins. I think I totally share your intuition that certain types of built-ins are going to make it much more likely that the behaviors actually emerge both kind of in the adult state and the developmental trajectory. So I actually have, if you were to, like, I'm kind of biased to think at this point that I think there are these, let me put it this way, even a convnet, which people think of as like being like the default state of a neural network at this point, is actually a very strong biased built-in structure. It's not an MLP. It's not a random neural network, right? So it's a bias that was sort of built into the structure by looking neuroscience and looking at behavioral science. And so I think that is what we should be doing. We should be finding, among other things, what the structural biases that you need to build in are such that the outcomes look like what we actually see. And so let me just turn that around. That's the form of understanding. Instead of asking whether the optimum, the actual take the optimum and try to understand it, like, I agree with you, they look very complicated. The actual results of evolution and development are very complicated. So what are we going to understand? Where's the simplicity going to be? It's not going to be in like the tuning curves of like cognitive areas, right? It's going to be more like answering a question like Hyo posed. What do we need to build into the architecture to get what we actually observe? And so I wouldn't wait.
There are many, many alternatives between those two extremes. An infinite number of alternatives between those two extremes.
Right, but
I think it's ridiculous to characterize all of traditional modeling as tuning curves, as it is to claim that the only way you can analyze a neural network is to look at optimization. I think the problem is we don't know what that space of possible explanations is. As I said, I'm a big fan of neural networks. I think people should be building these neural networks and trying to get them to work because, based on the progress we've made over the past 30 years, we're more likely to get neural networks to behave like people in a timely fashion before we're dead than we are using the traditional cognitive psychology approach, cognitive modeling approach. So I'm a big fan of that, but that doesn't mean that once you build that network, say you build a network that in some subset of tasks actually mimics human performance and human errors and human judgments really, really well. Well, now you actually have a really great platform for doing an infinite series of experiments infinitely fast. So you now can basically speed up neuroscience by treating your in silico system as a replacement for the in vivo system and just running it at 1 billion clock
No,
ticks.
that's totally true, right? So,
So
what
there's
now?
a lot of things
let's
you could do with that.
Now let's run that experiment forward in our head, right? So that's the second piece of the criteria I laid out. It should behave like humans, and then it should have components, and the components should should be mappable to the components of the brain at some level of resolution, whatever you might be interested in. You might need really high resolution if you want to fix the brain.
Both
You might-
of those things are also properties of the traditional approach to trying to model the brain.
Fair enough. So I don't think there's anything shocking about the criteria. But let me put it this way. I think it's easily plausible that the results of a complicated evolutionary developmental process, which you can maybe potentially model as a learning process, optimization process, are so complicated that,
That's
maybe all you
perfectly
can do-
possible,
yeah.
but that doesn't mean you should go in to that as an assumption.
No, I wouldn't
That's
assume
a
it,
hypothesis.
but at this point I would, but okay, I agree with that. It's plausible that they are not so complicated that you could potentially analyze them. That being said,
It's plausible that there are islands that are simple, interspersed with vast oceans of mysterious complexity.
absolutely. And so let me say, so
all those
therefore,
possibilities are there.
Therefore, but I as a working scientist, you have to have at least some bets. And my bet at this point is that at least for deep sensory systems, so this may be true in other parts of neuroscience, deep sensory systems, it's much more like small islands of interpretability in vast, mysterious outcomes. And so I'm much more biased at this point to be suggesting my students work on problems like what Hyo suggested than to suggest that they try to take the model and then peer into its internal features or something. Now, there's many things you could do with the techniques of visualization that are really interesting. So for example, let's say you have two models, you mentioned this situation, two models that have equally good explanatory power, pick the one that's simpler. Here's what I would do instead. Okay, you've got two models that are equally good at explaining the data as far as you know. You take the same technique that you would have to sort of generate an optimal stimulus, but instead you generate an optimal stimulus for separating the two models. And that's a really efficient class of stimuli to plug into your next experiment. Right? I mean, that's not a novel idea. Many people have suggested that type of thing. So, so this is not to say, that neuroscience experiments are not useful, and I totally agree with you that the utility of the model is exactly what you said. You can run a lot of simpler experimental prep experiments cheaply. But I would say that there's many things that you could do with that much more likely, to my mind at this point, to be useful, at least for deep sensory systems, than trying to understand how the features work rather than why they are the way they are.
Well, I'm glad you qualified deep sensory systems because they may be a special case, right?
Yeah.
There's a good argument to be made that infratemporal cortex is doing compressed sensing, where basically IT neurons are just random basis functions spanning the space of natural images, and if you have a compressed sensing system, then you're not going to do any better than. The best thing is just don't think about it, right? But at some point we also have, say, semantic systems where we assign meaning to the world, and those may operate by a completely different representational scheme that doesn't have this problem.
Absolutely.
That was my
higher cognition in some sense might turn out to be
simpler,
easier to characterize than these sort of intermediate sensory computations, for sure.
And
So
we kind of see that in physics as you go across scales too. You end up with these mysterious sort of linking areas where it's difficult to conceptualize them, and you end up with an emergent property that is simpler.
Yeah, exactly. That seems exactly right to me.
I'm going to pose a question to Jack, if that's okay. So one of the things that you mentioned is that what we're doing is basically significance testing rather than actually predicting. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, God, I could rant about this for 3 weeks, which let me try to come up with a 5-second version.
5 seconds is good, on this question.
Statistical significance is a measure of whether your data are likely. It's a kind of a bad way to measure whether your data are likely to come from a random process. It has nothing to do with effect size. It has nothing to do with prediction quality. So the whole point of statistical significance completely bypasses the issue of trying to build a predictive model that explains data. And my point was, I think in our field, we should be focusing more on building predictive models than statistical significance. Statistical significance is necessary but not sufficient for building such models. And until we start, trying to be, I think, as a community, more straightforward and honest about how good these predictive models are, how good our models are at predicting, it would be difficult for us to move forward because it's difficult to discriminate between models if the only metric you have for discrimination is randomness. And one thing I like about, another good thing about moving toward the neural network vein of doing things is they kind of afford experiments using more complicated tasks and stimuli, which I've long advocated for the reason that you have more headroom to build your models in.
But I guess one of the questions that came up from seeing your approach to measuring neural activity, the kinds of stimuli that you're using in order to understand the brain, it seems like the feature space, there's a lot of degrees of freedom in terms of what you think the features could be. Why can't they be constrained by what we learn from cognitive models? If we understand what are the relevant terms or the variables that explains human behavior, a lot of variance, those might be the right variables to look for in the brain, so why can't they constrain feature space in a way rather than presenting naturalistic stimuli or movies or narratives, and we're trying to find out what kind of things emerge from the data that we get.
It's perfect. I'm glad you're picking on me because I deserve to be picked on. There's two motives for this. The first is the notions we have of what the important variables are from classic cognitive psychology experiment may not, in fact, be the important variables. They're the variables that people studied, right? And those are basically operational definitions in laboratory tasks. The second, which doesn't mean that they're not appropriate in those domains, but it doesn't mean they're generalized. And it doesn't, we rarely test predictions because everybody's comparing models based on statistical significance. We don't really have any notion of how well these models work, really, even in the laboratory setting. And then on top of that, you have to layer the second factor, which is, the brain's a nonlinear dynamical system. There's no necessary reason that the brain is going to behave the same way out in the real world, even with the same cognitive process as it behaves in a limited situation.
So I guess the point that I was trying to make is that we actually do have some classes of models that are seemingly, or at least that's what I believe, that is predicting human behavior, and it generalizes across different kinds of tasks. It inspires us to produce or develop different kinds of tasks or novel tasks to predict, try to test the predictions. So
and you can make those into feature spaces and test them as models. There's
right,
no
that's
problem
exactly
with that.
what I was suggesting. And so you're agreeing with me?
Well, I'm agreeing that it's I'm agreeing that it's perfectly valid to take those models and then try to apply them in more naturalistic situations. Because if they work in naturalistic situations, then it validates your point and you're done, right? Which is because that's really what you want to do. You want to predict natural situations.
Do you think they're going to explain your data, Jack?
Well, in some sense, all of our models are Bayesian models because they're, if you think about it from an inference and optimization perspective dual, then any model we fit is a Bayesian model. The question, I think, the Tenenbaum sort of lineage is more focused on is how Bayesian are humans? When are they Bayesian? When are they not Bayesian? How far can you push this model to account for human behavior? And that's a perfectly valid, line of research and a perfectly interesting question, and you can fit those models to any arbitrary situation. In my lab, we haven't used complicated enough sort of game tasks, I think, of the kind that you were talking about to make those models worth fitting, but that's certainly a direction that I'm very interested in going in the future. So I think we'll make contact.
I saw some common ground emerge there between the three of you, actually, but it's a little bit unclear to me how an encoding model that's not a complex neural network, or at least a very high parametric model, can ever explain the computations without using sort of labels or some kind of oracle that tells you the semantic dimensions. Is that ever going to be an understanding of the computational process, or is it just a description of the representations across the brain?
Wait, what was the difference between a description and understanding?
Is it a process model, or does it just describe the tuning, essentially? You said we can go
I see. Well,
beyond tuning with models that are not process models of computation.
Even if you're an Alan Newell acolyte, you believe there's there's representations, there's data structures, there's functions that operate on those representations, and there's our control systems. And with MRI, we can get at the representations, and we can get at the functions in the sense of transformations between the representations, between areas, although it's difficult to know what areas are connected, which limits our ability to address that issue. I think where we really fail down in cognitive neuroscience in general is it's really hard to measure control systems, both because it's very slow, because behavioral manipulations of control systems are slow, and we don't have any good methods for measuring dynamics, and the methods we have are very low resolution. So if you could measure the control system really well, you could build that into your encoding model. It would just be a more complicated encoding model. It wouldn't just be based on tuning curves. It would have a control structure built into it. But you can do that. You can build a Markov model or whatever you want.
We're going to take 4 questions from the audience. Mariam, you can speak loudly or go to a mic. There's a mic there. Maybe you take this one first.
Well, it's more of a comment. I feel like you're trying to figure out what it means to understand the brain, but you haven't really defined the word understanding. And from what you've presented, you seem to have a different understanding of what it means to understand. And so, because you can say, well, I understand the brain if I can predict every single neuron's activity, or I can understand the brain if I understand the population activity or the learning mechanisms, or maybe the evolution, or maybe all I need is basic physics, because that predicts everything, how it works in the whole world. So maybe the first step towards trying to answer that question is to define what understanding would mean. Is it being able to intervene? Is it being able to predict at a certain level of detail? What is it?
Going to take the next question.
This is somewhat related. I want you guys to elaborate on individual differences. Dan somewhat touched on this. So in cognition, when we study, we usually actually hate the variance because we want our error bars to be small. But when you think about human race, when we want to build an artificial human, variability has to be part of it, and none of you actually touched on it. And it would be very creepy if all of that race would act exactly the same. It wouldn't be human at all. But it is very important when you're building our models, we are basically taking an average human and trying to build that average human. But it seems to be in the efforts to model that actually is not at all considered, which I think is important to be considered, but I want you guys to elaborate on it.
Take the next question.
Sure, this is just a question regarding beliefs, desires, states. These are words that, as a human being, I use to explain the world, but oftentimes when I see them formalized, they suddenly become rather uncanny in the sense that I don't actually understand what beliefs, desires, and states are anymore in a mathematical formula. So I'm wondering if we could elaborate on what those terms are and how we define them in a way that's for us mere mortals, as they say.
Next question.
Mine is very short. So we've been talking mostly about what does it mean to understand the brain. But one thing that is also really interesting to us is maybe what is a satisfying way of trying to understand what the brain is. So like you have the different views and all of them make sense, but we also like embedded in a space of human beings and we're all doing science and it's not everything is what we're doing is rational. So maybe some people think that deep neural nets, they're not really satisfying to them and you might wonder why. And it might have also to do with the worldview that we have. So I'm just wondering what your perspective would be on this.
All right, one final one.
My memory buffer for the questions is getting overloaded.
If I'm the last one, maybe you'll remember mine. There are many things in science that we understand that we can't build, like photosynthesis or the movement of planets or things like that. And so I was a bit surprised that you had such a high bar for understanding the brain as to being able to build something that does exactly the same thing.
All right. So take them in order, please.
So it's what is understanding?
What is understanding was
number one.
What is understanding?
I mean, I thought that's what we tried to do. It was just trying to come up with different definitions of understanding. And actually, I think there was quite a bit of agreement on that. I mean, it's kind of not that controversial at some level, right? You want one version of understanding, at least, is you're able to easily build a simulation. So that goes to the planets problem. You don't have to actually go build it. You just can build a simulation of it, and that's pretty easy to do with planets. An easily, low-cost simulation, and that in the case of cognitive computational neuroscience should generate behaviors like the agent. and should at least have at some resolution mapping to the parts of the brain. It just doesn't seem that controversial. The question becomes, more like, once you have that, what more can you get? You might be able to get more than that. You might be able to, instead of only being able to reproduce it the way that the evolution does via optimization, you might be able to replace that with a non-optimized version of it. So like, in V1, maybe we know enough about V1 via like the Berkeley wavelet transform or whatever, that we can replace some aspect of the optimization procedure that created that with a kind of closed formish solution to the system. And that's like replacing an optimization with a non-optimized thing that basically does the same thing or something similar. And to the extent that that can happen, I think that's great. The more you can get, the better. I just don't know we're guaranteed to have that. And so that's what I would say about that.
I think there's no right answer to this question because it depends on what you want to do. If you're a physicist and if you're a molecular biologist, you care about ion channels and you don't really care what they do. Who cares about computation? I have tons of colleagues like that at Berkeley. You couldn't care less about the fact that the brain's a computer. I actually personally, I hate to admit this, but I actually don't care about neurons. There could be little fairies in there hitting each other with wands. As long as the thing computes, I'm happy. It doesn't really matter. So everybody has their own perspective. But I think we all have to like touch base at the same place, which is we have to build models that accurately predict what the system does in the real world. Because if we're not there, then we're not getting we've got nothing.
Just to add one more to that, I agree with everything that you guys have said, but at the same time, if we're trying to explain the variance, I think it really matters. What are we using to explain those variances? Are we using the right kind of variables? If we explain all the variance out there, but we have no idea what those variables mean, then I think we have a problem in saying that we do have an understanding. So that's one thing I do want to add, where having a cognoscience perspective in studying human behavior allows us to know and understand what those variables are so that we can go out there and try to find how much variance those are explaining in terms of human behavior. If they're not doing well, then we know that those are not the right variables. If they're doing well, then we can go forward from there.
Yeah, and I basically agree with that in the sense that the thing that behavioral science actually has over neuroscience is that it's much closer to it's much like closer to the actual thing that we observe as humans in like ourselves. We're doing it all the time. We're doing cognitive science in our everyday lives. And so, it's likely, somehow it feels like psychology or behavioral science gives you the terms in which you want to state success or failure of the model. And maybe you don't always know what those terms are, and psychology experiments can help you discover that it's this class of terms, this class of variables as opposed to those. And those are exactly the kinds of variables that might then use to be sort of the target of the output of a system that you want to then use to explain the brain. So I think that's exactly right. It's also possible that sometimes you might be able to have a very downstream output behavior like communicate, and that the things that are just upstream of it might be a little bit inscrutable. So I don't think that it's required that every stage be totally scrutable, what the variables are, to be able to have something, right? The more scrutable, the better. But we also have to be open to the option that okay, yes, the thing at the end has got to be scrutable because we have to have at least a definition of what the behavior we mean in the first place is. Right? Just upstream of that, for example, communicate may require, so moral judgment, for example, might be you need to know intentionality and you need to know blameworthiness and a few other things. And so that's probably helpful. If you want to make a model of morality, you might want to make a model that has a little bit upstream from it some of those other concepts encoded. And psychology can help you figure out what some of those terms are. But I don't think it's totally required that at every stage all the variables are knowable.
Okay, our fearless leader has told us we have 3 minutes left. So,
so I think one thing, just to sort of wrap it up,
I'm not gonna do anything.
Everyone seems to be agreeing that we need process models, computational process models, right? I think all three of you would probably agree to that. So to some extent, the controversy is about what should be the variables in those process models and how many parameters should they have. And some of us have the intuition that we need to embrace these very high parametric models because AI intelligence is complicated. It needs to know a lot about the world. And we're hoping to get simple models, but we're not sure if that's in the cards. Is that a fair assessment? So what makes you...
I don't know what a process model is, but yeah.
So what makes you hope that you can work with much simpler models and still engage all of intelligence and explain how the brain
Me?
works?
No, I'm only making the argument that you should make the model as simple as possible. Like that's my only argument.
No simpler, okay.
Right. And
so
so I think the minute we start, the minute we have this sort of nihilistic view of, oh, it's pointless to try to make the model simpler, then that leads down a certain path that I don't find attractive myself.
You also said you want to predict data, right? In order to predict data, you have to make the model simpler than possible, simpler than the true system, right?
No. Well, you're going to get a predict in a probabilistic sense, but somebody mentioned earlier, let's just build a brain by like extracting all the neurons and and all the connections and all their functional connections and just reiterating the entire brain. And yeah, sure, that should work, but that seems like a kind of unsatisfying model.
Yeah, I think that's
As you
because
pointed out, we can build one of those already.
Right, and the reason, one way in the criteria for why you might think it's unsatisfying is it's not easy to build that model, right? It's like really hard to do that very detailed copying. Ideally, the place the simplicity comes is you somehow have a way of compressing the procedure. Let's call that a procedural or process model. Some way to compress the description of the procedure that builds it. So that's why I think I basically share many people's intuition that a copy of the brain is not understanding of the brain. But if you know how to compress the procedure that builds it, you end up with some form of understanding, even if what comes out of it itself is hard to then sort of rephrase in non-optimization terms.
Yeah, so my analogy for that is it's like if you want to know how gravity works, you may need to invent calculus. But the fact that you invented calculus so that you can write the equations that describe how gravity works doesn't mean that calculus describes how gravity works. And to me, the neural network is the tool that you're using to try to understand the system. But figuring out a good optimization rule that allows you to build a neural network that simulates the system doesn't mean that the understanding of the system is in the optimization rule.
No, you need to know more. You need to know the architecture class and also the goal. So you're right. I think you're totally right. The optimization rule is like the calculus, right? But the goal is like the positing that the force is falls off as the square of the distance.
Well, if you're going to go down that road, I
think that's kind of that's a very loose analogy, but it's like, yeah, you totally need more than the math or the very idea of a neural network. You need to also have an hypothesis about what it's doing.
Sure, you get the final word.
Well, thanks. Yeah, great. I just wanted to add one more thing to that, which is that it's what I argued for, and I think hopefully people are agreeing here, is that we do need to have a good model of how cognition works. I just wanted to address one question about individual differences there. I think it's true that in a lot of cognitive science behavioral experiments and the ways that we try to explain the variance, there's tons of individual differences, and we can't explain exactly where they come from. However, the idea is that if we do have a good model of what seems to be universal across humans, like we have memory, we are planning our actions in a certain way, how those actions emerge is based on our knowledge or experience or the kinds of things that we have accumulated for 30 or whatever years that we have been living in the world. And so if we understand the process by which it works, then we can hopefully later try to understand what the individual differences are, where they're coming from, based on the kind of experiences that each individual has accumulated so far. But then that's a tall order. So for now, I'm okay treating or looking at the averages, at least within the kinds of experiments that I do.
All right, that wraps up the session. Let's thank the speakers again.